anxious, fearful, avoidant, disorganized. All different ways to describe insecure attachment styles, and maybe you may know about them a little bit, or you've gone through these experiences yourself in the dating world. These attachment styles, these insecure attachment styles, avoidant, anxious, fearful, avoidant, also clinically known as disorganized, are when our ETCs come and start to hijack our romantic relationships. And let's go into understanding what each one of these means and which rooted ETC is the cause of the suffering of that insecure attachment style. And before we get into those, let me just explain what secure attachment is, because there's one secure attachment style and then there are three insecure attachment styles. So secure attachment means that someone is comfortable in relationships, no matter if there are any misunderstandings, if there are lulls and pockets and moments of miscommunication, or they know how to overcome conflict. They generally feel secure in themselves, and hence they feel secure in their relationships as well. And that is only one type of attachment style. That's the golden standard that we want to get to. The three insecure ones that a lot of us are plagued with out there when it comes to our romantic relationships include anxious attachment style, avoidant attachment style, and disorganized attachment style. That's the clinical term, but in pop psychology, you might hear it as fearful avoidant, which is very telling of what disorganized is. And that's the hot and cold relationship. Let's get into the other two first before we get into the disorganized attachment style. Anxious attachment style is pretty telling. Up until now, we do know that anxiety is rooted in fear, the emotion that causes suffering of fear. So anxious attachment style is when fear comes and hijacks your relationship. And usually someone who is exhibiting anxious attachment style in a relationship or in the dating scene, they will overfunction. They will do more than is necessary because there's that fear of losing the person, or fear of something going wrong, or fear of not being enough. And a person with anxious attachment style usually has a hard time going through lulls of non-communication. They need consistent communication and reassurance, which unfortunately is a bottomless pit, because again, that's dealing with the symptoms, but that's not dealing with the actual root emotion, which is the fear. And so the coping mechanisms, or ping-ponging with ways to control the situation, usually come into play, which would be excessively reaching out to a romantic partner, or constantly worrying about something, or overthinking things, or excessively analyzing messages and points of conversations, or constantly trying to do something else. What else can I do? What else can I do? What else can I give? How else can I show up in order to hopefully preserve the relationship? And if there's ever this feeling of the other person pulling away, it creates more of an anxiety grip. It makes the person with anxious attachment style come and try to latch on stronger. And often we see it in codependent type of dynamics and codependent relationships. Codependent dynamics, which again is just making the other person their source of happiness or comfort or ease. And that is making something and someone outside of you your source of peace or comfort or love or joy. And it's never going to work, because it's always an inside job. And again, waiting for someone outside of you to make you feel better, in this case a romantic partner, is still not touching the fear. It might distract you for a little bit. It might cool off the fear a little bit, kind of like that OCD cycle that we've talked about, where the excessive worry or thinking happens, and then the compulsions will show up in order to try to appease the thinking, but the root here is not being addressed. Same with anxious attachment style. There's that fear of my partner's pulling away from me. Let me do this, this, and this. with these actions, ways to control it or manipulate it or change the scenario to feel more attached and connected and bonded, but the fear is actually not being addressed in this case. So it's going to be, unfortunately, a bottomless pit of attempts with no peace or comfort or security that ever gets attached, because then that will ever get created between the two, because then there's another thing and then another thing and then another thing. Now let's go to avoidant attachment style. Avoidant attachment style is actually the hardest to connect with. You can think of it as obviously having more of a depressive, rooted more in grief than any other emotion that causes suffering, because it's that withdrawal feeling, that heaviness, the let me not get close, it hurts, it's uncomfortable. And attachment style wise, relationship wise, what makes avoidant attachment style the hardest is because usually they have never, a person with that attachment style has never actually developed a solid connection or intimate connection. And this is not talking about sexual intimacy, but it's more like emotional intimacy or being able to rely on someone. This is someone who is hyper independent, does everything on their own, never can count on anyone else, doesn't let a lot of people in, usually has more objectified relationships, doesn't want to, it keeps it more a little bit on the surface. It could show up with a lot of addictive types of behaviors, more dopamine seeking rather than connection seeking. Let me just seek pleasure rather than fulfillment, because there's a disconnect here. I can't actually connect with someone, which requires being vulnerable, which also requires allowing all of yourself to be seen. And someone with avoidant attachment style has been shut down in that area or never given the opportunity to develop, possibly from a childhood experience of neglect or excessive criticism, or possibly some type of abuse as well, which will shut someone down. And someone who is avoidant attachment style needs someone to help draw them out, requires someone to be very patient with them and very consistent with them as well too, and at the same time give them space. So again, it makes it really hard because it's trying to develop a connection and get beyond just a dopamine hit with this person. Now, going into disorganized attachment style. Disorganized attachment style, which is known as being fearful avoidant, is full on rooted in anger. And as we've talked about before, anger is more a secondary emotion that's rooted in both fear and grief. So it makes sense that disorganized, that is fearful avoidant, which is rooted in both fear and grief, would show up with more anger. That's that hot and cold relationship, and that strongly implies a history of trauma. That's the attachment style where you want to connect, but then get scared once the connection starts happening. So there's a constant push-pull. It is the relationship that has a lot of high highs and low lows. It's the one that starts off really hot and then gets really cold. It's the one that probably love bombs you and then leaves you ghosted. That's more of that fearful avoidant attachment style or disorganized attachment style. That one is best approached slowly to establish safety before you try to create connection. And just like with avoidant attachment style, and it's also true with anxious attachment style, consistency is key, and clear communication is key, because someone with a disorganized attachment style may create a lot of scenarios in their mind to try to fill in the gaps of the hot and cold. Because again, they're constantly overly cautious. That's a trauma response, but at the same time, they want that connection. So they'll get in their heads a lot when it comes to should I get close? Should I not? Constantly trying to analyze and interpret a certain behavior, and then getting in their heads about it, and then pulling back, and then being with the person and feeling really comfortable, and then not seeing them, and then questioning things. it's a really, really hard place to be in, and that's why it is called disorganized clinically, disorganized attachment style clinically, because there's no peace in that, right? And it just constantly vacillates between anger, fear, and grief. Anger, fear, and grief. Again, and that's where it indicates implication of trauma once you see disorganized attachment style. Personality disorder wise, it may show up more like borderline in that way. Or other more severe clinical diagnosis like bipolar. Those are the ways that disorganized attachment style may show up. Where anxious attachment style will show up with someone who may have anxiety, or someone who has OCD, for example, or avoidant attachment style would be someone who is clinically depressed, or someone who may have some narcissistic tendencies because they are so emotionally and empathically detached, and that's what makes it a little bit harder to connect with someone who has avoidant attachment style. So that's just a quick overview of how these ETCs are showing up in relationships in terms of attachment styles. And in our next video, we're going to go into just understanding what to do about all of this now. Now that we've learned what the problems are, how they may show up in our lives, and in our relationships, and in our mood, and in our day-to-day lives, now we need to know what to do about them. If coping is not the first line of defense or the first option to work through these emotions that cause suffering, then I'd love to show you what actually is. I'll meet you in the next video to find out. May peace be with you.